Hi everybody, Steve here, and let's talk Palo Alto. This is a film directed by Gia Coppola. Gia Coppola is actually a cousin of Sofia Coppola. Some of you may have seen some Sofia Coppola films like The Virgin Suicides. Uh, Sofia's a pretty good director. Gia this is her first film. She's still very young. I think she's still in her 20s. So it's actually very kind of impressive that she was actually able to get a feature film up while she's still in her 20s. And she's a cousin of Francis Ford Coppola. What's interesting about this film, equally or sort of more so interesting than a lot of other adaptations, is you've got a change in gender, and that's what I'm quite interested in discussing with this film. Like, what actually happens when, say, a female director adapts a source written by a male, and we can also think about the other way. What happens when a male director adapts work written by a female? Does something happen to the work? Is it regendered or something like that? Is it given, if a male's directing a female's work, does it become more masculine? If a female is directing a male's work, does it become, I don't know, less masculine? They're kind of issues to work through. What's interesting about this, though, is it wasn't just by luck that it happened to be a female directing this work. James Franco, who has written the source for this film, it was a series of short stories which he published within one volume, which is called Palo Alto. He only was willing to have the work adapted if a female directed the film. He didn't want a male directing the movie. And have a think about that when you're watching the film. Why does Franco want only a female directing it? And a lot of it would have to do with the strong female characters. Franco probably being a little bit cautious or worried about what a male may do to those young characters. He also wanted a director who was actually quite young and sort of this, an age which wasn't too far from the representation of the characters. This is a teen movie. The characters are being represented are sort of between sort of 15 and 20 by and large, and he wanted a director who was just sort of understood that generation and also part of the generation. Also, I mean, when we talk about directors adapting, I think what's interesting is, because this is such a contemporary film, both James Franco, the writer of the source, and Gia Coppola, the adapter of the source, are of a similar age to one another. So again, they're sort of coming from the same generation, and I think that also helps when adapting. If you sort of understand the sensibilities and also the anxieties of the person you're adapting, that can also be a great help. So let's just talk through Leach's modes as they apply to the film, or some of the modes which I think is sort of worth discussing. So it's certainly analogy adaptations. These are sort of the inspired by, the based on adaptations. And what's actually happening with this movie is what Gia Coppola is doing. She's doing a similar thing to what Robert Altman did with Shortcuts. And what he did was he took a whole bunch of Raymond Carver stories and he shaped sort of one narrative. It was sort of a very kind of long-winded narrative. I don't know if you've seen Shortcuts, but it's this sort of 3-hour movie which has a whole bunch of short stories kind of woven into one another. I guess what's different with Gia Coppola's movie is the way that she essentially is working with stories that are part of the same volume, right? So what happened with the book is James Franco wrote a whole bunch of short stories which had kind of overlap, and he published them as one work. Where with Shortcuts, what's happening is Raymond Carver's writing stories across many, many years, and he didn't really see them as anything to be connected. And what Robert Altman did was he actually connected them. So there is far more sense to adapt, say, Palo Alto, because there's already the connections there and the overlaps there, and that's what she's doing. But Shortcuts is actually being referenced by both James Franco and Gia Coppola as sort of an inspiring way of kind of structuring the short stories and also the film. And we can talk about that in a sec. So yeah, I think it is a sort of an analogy adaptation in the way that there's sort of an inspiration of other works to this film. It's certainly a celebration adaptation, so the celebration being the heavy reluctance to change the exact words or sentiment of the source. So this is what Gia Coppola said. I read the book and loved it, so that's the project we decided to pursue together. So Franco and her were talking about adapting or working on something together. Now, what's interesting with the whole thing about celebration adaptation is you're sort of in awe of the source and you don't want to change the source. Now, James Franco made it pretty much impossible for her to change great things of the source because here is the person who wrote the source and he's part of the production. Now, Gia Coppola is a very inexperienced filmmaker, and James Franco actually had to talk her into directing this film. And because James Franco is also a director, he actually helped her through kind of camera setups and working with the actors and things like this. So he was sort of the, I don't know, the untitled co-director here. Now, he's also acting in the film, so he's kind of there. So she can't make great changes to his source without James Franco knowing and perhaps objecting. She really needs James Franco. And you may watch this thinking, well, there is actually, it could have done with some more critical engagement of the source. You know, there are changes that she could have made that she didn't because of James Franco's presence in the work. And that's a really interesting way of adapting when you have the person who wrote the source actually part of the adaptation. And it can happen. It can happen. By accident, as she can be a direction of the adapter, like David Fincher, who did Gone Girl, and he's working with the author of Gone Girl actually on the screenplay. So sometimes it is a sort of something that the person adapting wants because they don't want to move too far from the sentiment of the adapted, but it can also cause some real problems in not great changes can be made. Something else Gia Coppola said, which is interesting, is this. One of the features of James's book that really struck me was how capable he was of conveying the young female perspective. So often he was dead on. Now, female characters become central to the story, and she's really wanting to celebrate that of James Franco's writing, and it becomes the feature and the central sort of dominance of the film. That here is a film with really strong female leads and female characters on the screen. And that's again sort of making it a celebration that she is not wanting to change that about the short stories. So it's also an adjustment adaptation. So this is kind of, it adjusts, changes, and alters the source without losing the sentiment. Now, I'm just going to read you a couple of quotes from Gia Coppola. So she said, "The April story really stood out to me. I love the longing of the two characters. They are people who can't really express their feelings. Plus, it was a bit of a longer story, so there was more for me to work with. I also love the dialogue in the Jack O story. I thought it would be a good way to frame the whole piece with a beginning and end. While those were the three main stories I took from, I did take elements from the other stories. Unlike a novel, I had to take bits and pieces from all of Palo Alto's stories to make it for the screen." Now, she also said, "I didn't want a series of vignettes. And finally, after I wrote each story in screenplay format, it was much easier for me to see how I could combine characters and intertwine them into one cohesive story." So what she's talking about in all of these quotes, all these separate quotes, is structure. How is she actually going to structure the film? Now, unlike James Franco's stories or book, which is actually just sort of short, short stories, because written independently from each other, she's not wanting that. So she's not wanting the film to seem like sort of like 3 or 4 short stories within one movie, because she felt that was that would sort of upset the flow of it. And if you say a film like Four Rooms, which Tarantino directed one of the sequences, it can be a bit jarring when you're watching a feature film and it's sort of short films within one feature film. So she wanted it to have a greater flow. So what she's actually doing is she's adjusting James Franco's structure. And that's really the central change that she's making to the work, that she's adjusting the structure here. Now, she's taking one story, which is the April story, and she's saying, okay, that's going to frame it. That's going to give me the beginning, and that's going to give me the end. She's taking other things from it, like the Jacko story. She's really interested in the dialogue, and there's really good dialogue going on in that story and what she's doing with it. And she says this also, unlike a novel, I had to take bits and pieces from all of Palo Alto's stories to make it for the screen. So um, it's not just like a novel where with a novel you're essentially condensing and you're stripping away. Where what she's actually having to do is pick bits and pieces from it all to actually make it as one cohesive work. And also, I think was kind of interesting, and sort of screenwriters would be interested in what she says about the screenplay format and how it's much easier to see how it could combine the characters and intertwine them into one cohesive story. That to keep everything separate, which would have been a bit too jarring. So when you're watching the film, think about that also. Does it flow as one cohesive story? And also illusion. I think illusion is really interesting here. And the illusion is how it directly alludes to many different cultural contexts. So the film was shot in the homes of Val Kilmer. Val Kilmer appears, as does his son. His son appears pretty much for the first time. And the film was also shot in actually Gia Coppola's mother's house, which is, again, really interesting. And so it makes it sort of that allusions, to the real life existence of these people. And I think there's sort of, these actual celebrities that have been cast, like Val Kilmer. Val Kilmer's kind of there as Val Kilmer. He's sort of, it's kind of interesting the way Val Kilmer's used. And also, it makes connections to other serious adolescent films. And that's how it wants to be considered, right? Other serious adolescent films. So The Virgin Suicides, which I said earlier, Sofia Coppola directed, which is Gia's cousin. So in April's bedroom, there's a poster of the film, can be seen on her wall. So it's wanting to say this is a bit like The Virgin Suicides. It's a bit like that teen angst kind of film with strong female characters. So Where the Wild Things Are is also interesting, where Teddy imagines himself in this movie is shown wearing the costume of Max while walking in the woods. So again, Where the Wild Things is really fascinating because Where the Wild Things Are is a kid's story, but what's actually going on in the 2009 movie is that he's actually making it for a older generation, for a sort of teen generation, or also for an adult generation. So again, it's making all of those connections to the work of what's really going on in Palo Alto.